welcome everybody to a new edition of the Art Business Podcast. My guest today is pretty well known in the art world, I would say, particularly in the UK, London-based, Marina Tanguy, and we're going to talk about her work later into the podcast. But welcome, Marina, and thank you very much for giving up some of your busy time this morning.
It's a total pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so I'm going to start by asking, some usual questions. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about, do you have a favorite city, and if so, why?
I think London is my favorite city. It's very much home, and it has everything that I love, which is on a daily basis, you can meet new people from all walks of life, who thinks in very different ways about life. You have a very vibrant cultural scene, and your contemporary art scene is also equally as vibrant, equally as challenging. I remember feeling so proud when I went to the BFA in December and them showcasing, how much the cultural scene in London is doing. So I think it is London. It is home. It's now also, where my kids were born. So it's very much home.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you say. I guess if I was being interviewed, I probably find it quite. I think London is a kind of taken in some ways, but I think it's wonderful just to hear the way you talk about London. I don't know about you, but I find it quite hard to put my finger on exactly what it is and why people want to come here, because when you grow up in the place, you kind of see the bad as well as the good. Whereas when you visit from abroad, for example, you see it through very exotic eyes and want to go to Camden Market and look at statues of Amy Winehouse, etc.
There is a very strong resilience in the city. I actually just over the Christmas period, I watched a documentary. I don't know if you know, but Amsterdam was the first mega city, and then it was London, and then it was New York. But London very much, reopened itself and became so modern. Thanks, if I can say thanks, to the Great Fire, because it had to rebuild itself and it had to re-question itself. And in fact, it wasn't that modern. Amsterdam was completely leading the way at the time. And then again, sadly, after World War II and being bombed, it was able to have a stronger diversity of people, stronger diversity of buildings, because again, it had to step up and rebuild. I think I'm attached to the idea of resilience, and I'm attached to the fact that it has been a strong diversity of people who's rebuilt this city. It hasn't been a type of people. And I think it probably informed again the cultural scene, and the fact that you don't just have a type of person in that cultural scene. So it's a fascinating city, and it is one of the oldest city in the world in that sense. So I think there's a lot to say on why London is a fascinating place to be in.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I'm taking my students to those two extremes. I'm taking them to the city, and the city, as you know, in London has two meanings. It means the ancient Roman city, Londinium, but it has come to mean the financial district. So I'm taking them to the new Bloomberg, or the recent Bloomberg building by Norman Foster, which is something like 90% sustainability tested, and they have an ancient Roman temple underneath in the archaeology, which is an immersive experience. But they also support contemporary art. So that's a kind of good example of that antiquity to contemporary. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Marine. A non-urban location, do you have any kind of favorite places you like to move out of the city to?
So I think that is the hard part. So I grew up in a tiny island off the west coast of France, so the total opposite of London. It's called Ile de Ré, faces La Rochelle. You have to cross to mainland to go to high school. It's very remote. So I would probably say that this is where I would escape to, because obviously my granny is still there, my family is still there, and I want my kids again to kind of get exposed to where I grew up. It's very beautiful. The sea is everywhere. It's incredibly flat, so you just cycle through everything. And yes, and I think having grown up by the seaside, I think the place I would must escape to is being by the sea at all times of the year, and feeling like visually just so resourced from it.
You're very lucky, and of course you're now in an island, but much bigger, in a very different place. That sounds fantastic. And buildings. Do you have if I say, you know, can you think of a building that you really love for whatever reason? Can you pick on
I
one?
think buildings is actually where lies my biggest contradiction in life, and my because so I live in a Georgian home. Our office is by Bond Street Station, and I live in a Georgian home, the Wellis Collection. I adore the aesthetics of the Georgian and Victorian homes, but I adore the social values of the Brutalist building, but I don't like the aesthetic of it. So I feel stuck in architecture because I adore everything that is about equity and, you know, giving access to the same opportunities. And obviously the Brutalist movement was really trying to equalize everything, but I'm just not seduced by the aesthetics. So I feel stuck in the middle in architecture because what I like visually doesn't actually embrace the values I hold. So it's where I feel completely stuck. I haven't succeeded to kind of solve it yet.
I actually really like brutalist architecture, not necessarily, you know, it's because it's a challenging aesthetic, obviously. But I think that there are some brutalist buildings. My one that I really love, and you probably know the name of the architect, Dennis Lasdon. He did the. I really like the National Theatre for some reason, and there's a great story about Dennis Lasdon. When the building opened, there was a press conference within what is the National Theatre. One of the architectural journalists asked him, "Where's the decoration?" Because, you know, it's all that beautiful. It always reminds me of ancient Rome, where they used wooden shuttering to pour their concrete, and they plastered over it because you weren't meant to see the grain of the wood. Obviously, Romans liked everything had to be smooth and marble-like, but he deliberately sort of leaves that out, so you get the lovely rough surfaces of the wood, which I think is amazing. But he turned to this critic and said, "Madam, you are the decoration," which you probably couldn't get away with today. But it's a really funny quote.
Yes, well, I think on the Madame, probably I would not use a gender, but I would say maybe he was putting a stage for people, and I think that would make sense that the people are
exactly
the activation of the building. But you know what, I found it interesting. I'm just really not attracted to it, but I would be able to study it. I would be able to read about it, and it's really a case of just not being attracted to it visually.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's that. And music. Are you into music at all?
Well, my second son is called Vivaldi, so I think that probably answers your
and
question.
the first one's Atlas, is that
The
right?
first is Atlas, the second is Vivaldi. I mean, poor kids, they have a lot to answers over the coming years. But therefore that probably answers on
Yep.
our favorite music by the parents. And I think it's a philosophy also. Vivaldi was actually a priest, and he very much believed in the power of music being healing. And the Four Seasons is very much accepting that there are highs and lows. There's, you know, life is a constant flux, which I very much relate to, and hence his name.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think Vivaldi is one of those composers that everyone, you know, it's very accessible but very beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, and that brings me to the next question, which has similar, you know, we can all think of artists that we, a bit like buildings, that we really can engage with, but we don't necessarily like. So this is a really difficult one, I guess, for people working in the art world. But if someone put a gun against your head and said, right, you could take one work of art to a desert island, what would it be, Maureen?
I have an answer for this. Although actually I could not take it to a random island because it's disintegrate, so it wouldn't be possible.
A virtual island.
Yeah. It's the Wrath of the Medusa by Jericho.
Wow.
Because that's the first ever work of art I saw. And I think it really, for me, brings all the reasons why I'm in the sector. There's a political and social vision to the Wrath of the Medusa, as you know, or maybe for people who don't know. It was specifically capturing a shipwreck, but the ones who were poor and who were on the boat were left behind. The rich were able to survive. So it was touching upon something that was a social problem at the time. Secondly, he had been going to the morgue and looking at corpse to really make sure that it was, you know, technically the closest possible to reality, but there was really a lot of innovation in terms of how he did it. And the reason why therefore is so, like, you can't just pass it, you have to look at it emotionally. And going back to Vivaldi, it's a very emotional painting. So although it's describing a social fact, although it's political, it's incredibly realistic. He's been able to convey a lot of emotion to it, which I think all those components are very hard. And finally, there's an element of romance that I really like, because I think that's the romantic movement. There's so many letters, apparently, that when he was painting it, he was getting so excited. And I think it just says something quite beautiful on like the joy, the sheer joy of having done that painting. But the reason it would not be possible to carry it is because he used a series of pigments from the industry of the time. That means, and it's very romantic, that this painting over time is becoming darker. And ultimately, this painting will disappear. But given the fact that it's a shipwreck, I kind of love it, which is the reason I couldn't be able to transport it to everywhere. But that is definitely the painting that changed a lot of things for me.
Yeah, and it obviously also has tremendous contemporary resonances. I think several contemporary artists have used that as a basis for a contemporary view of that, and of course the boat people situation in the UK, well, and in the Mediterranean, all over the world, in fact. So
it's incredibly contemporary. But I think for me, like all the works of the past, that made it to today and shaped today are very contemporary. Like this is a great example that is incredibly relevant, and it's always been relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as I understand it, your first work in the art world was at Outsiders Gallery in London in 2012.
Yes, as my first official job role. Before this, I studied at Warwick University, and I was helping out on the stand at the PAD Andrew Lamberty, which had a design gallery. So I was doing the research, but I was also running the stands in New York, London, and Paris, which is the reason when I was able to get gallery manager at the Outsiders, because actually through that I was able to meet my first collectors. I was able to network. So it is how I landed the job. Steve Lazardis is a fascinating character. For the ones who don't know, he discovered Banksy and many contemporary artists and street artists, such as J.R. Connor Harrington and many others that we would know today. He is also one of the first, I think, or one of the few council estate boy who was able to build that level of galleries. And I think I feel incredibly lucky to have had that as a first school, because therefore he wasn't that bothered about obeying to all the rules of the art world. And obviously, as you know, we came on to becoming disruptors later. So I think being exposed to someone who questions the rules and questions the status quo and questions who is part of the sector at 21 was frankly quite extraordinary, because it's the first time you get exposed to the sector at that stage. And he was able to tell me that while you must understand rules, it's also good to question whether they're in the first place and whether they're necessary or not, or whether it's good to change them.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, since I started working at the Institute, Sotheby's Institute, and really had to immerse myself in contemporary art world, I had students who were really excited by street art. I had an alumna who worked for Steve Lazaridis when he was in Fitzrovia. And then I think he then moved down to a really posh building, possibly Georgian, down in St. James, was it?
Yeah, so that's a different company many moons later and more recently.
Yeah, you're talking about outside. Yeah.
When I was there, he had the gallery on Raven Place, Lazaridis itself, the Outsiders on Greek Street in Soho, and then the studios in Wapping, and then was doing a lot of, and that also informed a lot of our brand partnership department, but he was doing, and our public art department actually too, because he was taking over the Old Vic. He was like where now 180 the Strand is. Also, he was taking over the Vinyl Factory and doing loads of experiences. So he understood the world of entertainment. We had the singer Massive Attack, that is also an artist called 3D. He was very much at the forefront of collaboration within the arts, partnerships, and really expanding the definition of the arts and bringing new audiences to it.
I think a lot of people don't realize that, actually. They just see him and they think of Banksy. And I remember Sotheby's when they had their controversial commercial gallery S2, which has closed down, I think, during COVID. But do you remember Steve Lazaridis actually curated a show for them with Banksy?
Well, I think it's interesting that we, again, for us as a talent agency, we now do public art, so it's not illegal. I think street art, we see a lot of people be illegal, to just kind of say the difference. But it does say a lot that we have parked street art for a long time. I mean, this is art being made by people who are not from privileged background. The fact that they've been parked for a long time does inform of the relationship that we have with the arts at large. I think there's plenty to say on the reason why it's not discussed in the way it should be discussed. And as we will be studying it, we'll probably realize still the many problems that the sector is experiencing. So it's still an undergoing conversation in the sector to how we make it more inclusive, how do we welcome larger audiences, how do we partner better, and I don't think this is solved yet.
I agree entirely. Talking about like public street art, do you know the Street Art Museum in Amsterdam? Have you ever been out to that?
MoMA, yes. Well,
Sama.
Oh, Sama, sorry, no, I thought
yeah.
Yes, I do. But actually, MoMA is also coming to London, and we're helping that. So I thought that was also the connection, because I had done a show also, Banksy, in Amsterdam,
That's right.
A lot of people talking to.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, actually, Melanie Pasha, always we visit Amsterdam when we go to TFAF, a very different place. And one of my colleagues usually goes to it's, what is it? It's MoMA. MoMA, yes, of course, yeah. And that it's quite interesting, the Street Art Museum in Amsterdam, because it's like curated and the artists are commissioned, and so we always have this very interesting ethical argument about, does that reduce the kind of frisson of the street art, the knowledge that is actually allowed to be painted. It's an interesting discussion that we have when we go there.
Yeah. It's interesting. For me, street art should be just on the streets. It has its context is so political that its context is the street. But then I guess I'm quite comfortable in thinking of different types of art and different types of environments. And I feel you don't have to transpose at all times the art in different environments. Like, you don't always have to have the art in a white cube. Like, if the art's biggest impact is to be on the street, then just leave it on the streets. That is where the conversation actually should be. So I prefer it on the streets. I think that's where it belongs to, and I think that's where it drives the very needed conversation that it wants to drive.
Yeah, I remember the first Banksy I saw, I didn't even know who he was. When the South Bank in 2000 2000, when Tate opened in the former, power station. That whole South Bank, I don't know whether you'd remember it. It was really a no-go area after dark. Yeah. And that is exactly where Banksy began to do his works, including the Girl with the Balloon on Waterloo Bridge, of course. But the first one I saw was under a bridge, and it was the famous one with what was it? The City Gents with their umbrellas and bowler hats in a demonstration. It was fantastic, and I just, and no one knew who this person was at that stage, and things have changed.
It's quite interesting in itself, and I think this is why I also love the interaction in the everyday, and we will talk about that and I feel, for me, like, again, we've tried a lot as a company to create everyday interaction with the arts, not just a special occasion as you feel like to be dressed up in a certain way and then you walk into this building, but that everyday interaction that just imprint that memory, for me, is quite special. And I think that there's a place for all types of interaction with the arts. You don't just have a type of behavior you should have with it, which is just holding a glass of champagne, just looking at it, having to look clever. You can have all types of interactions. You can have fun interaction, political interactions, everyday interactions. And I think I like the fact that, like, you just didn't know who he was, and that was your interaction on that day. That is quite special. It's a very different one than walking again in a specific building.
Yeah, and it was very impressive. I was certainly taking pictures of it, thinking, isn't that wonderful? Then you moved to LA. I think.
I was 21, therefore running the gallery of the Outsiders with Lazaridis. I think I was probably the youngest at the time to do that.
Yes.
I think we did well in positioning the gallery and press-wise as well, which meant that this investor, Steph Sabak, who was running an advertising company in Los Angeles, heard of us. And asked, like he said, like, I would love to have my own gallery and I would love to therefore invest in someone to build it. We became co-founders and co-partners. He put the money in, I built the gallery. I named it after the island I come from, which is Ile de Ré. It was Doré Gallery, very different context because we were next to Beverly Hills on Melrose Avenue with a very different crowd because we opened with Demi Moore and a lot of celebrities at the time. I think LA informed a lot of who I am today. I was 23. I had never dreamt of being in Los Angeles, first of all. I still have my little bicycle here, no driving license, and I read books all the time. I just, I was not prepared to be living in LA at any time soon.
Well, you have to have a car, really.
Exactly. I never did, but it was,
No, it's amazing.
I can definitely disclose it was challenging. And I feel therefore, when it comes to entertainment, communication, marketing, and again, nurturing large audiences, LA completely reshifted my brain. And I think also somebody else that reshifted my brain and has since remained a supporter is Michael Lovitz, who built one of the largest talent agency in the world called CAA. On the art world side, he's very known as one of the largest collector too. But CAA, UTA, WME are the three largest talent agencies in the world. WME now owns Freeze for the art world. CAA is now owned in majority by Pinot, who is also a big collector in France. So actually, the art world has always been quite tied to those places. But Michael Lovitz built CAA at the time. To give you an idea, he built the careers of the top celebrities. He'll be behind all the adverts of Coca-Cola, Steven Spielberg, anything you can think of in terms of the top movies was out of CAA. And I think for me, it reshifted the fact that while I had this beautiful gallery, because it was absolutely beautiful, it felt that I had an empty space where a few people will come from time to time, whereas Michael had shaped culture. He had shaped the conversation we discuss, the content we see. He had inspired people at large. And all of this was driven by the brain and the creativity of the talents he had backed. And that just was much more the job I wanted to do. It felt much more in the pulse of contemporary culture and felt that I could open up new revenue streams to my talent and new audiences to my talents as well, which will be the artists in this case. So I decided to leave this partnership and this glamorous lifestyle, which was very glamorous, and try and build the first talent agency in the art world. The difference is, while I was very grateful that Steph invested in me, because it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I would never have met Michael, I would never have kind of got exposed to everything I got exposed in LA. I wanted to build it on my own to understand the economics of the model I was building. I think something I didn't like about receiving investment from the start is it felt like there was a lot of veneer, but I wasn't sure my business model was actually working economically. So I took on trainers and decided to be broke, but really to do it step by step. So that once we scale, when we become a larger company, I know my foundations are solid and I understand this economics, and having not had a business and economical background, it felt essential for me to comprehend that side and feel confident in it. So then I could then scale. So that was when I was 25. That is almost 9 years ago. And yes, I mean, I'm, blown away myself about everything that's happened since, I think is the answer. My lucky, there's been many lucky things that happened in why we are here today and why it was successful. You would know one of them, but two entrepreneurs exited their businesses and sold it and joined me. One of them is Lisa Arlo, who built one of the first fractional ownership platform in Europe. And after several years, she joined me, and that was a game changer in terms of having another entrepreneur on board. Jan Matthias spent 25 years building a creative agency, and actually also the MBAs, the Central St. Martins, also sold this company and joined me. So this really helped me building up the company. Of course, the corporate hires from Chris's, Sotheby's and Vogue, etc. really helped me on the corporate side. But I would say Lisa and Jan were a game changer. Also timing, I think, when we started, because we became also the first B Corp in the art world, and for anyone who doesn't know what B Corp stands for, it's the idea that while you aspire for economical growth, you also aspire to do so with social values. And it's quite strict metrics in how you do that. And we therefore published a social manifesto when we started. And the entire art world told us this is madness. Like if you're slightly social or political, your business will fail within 2 seconds. But, you know, I was 25 and you have the use of thinking that you can just do what you want because that is the beauty of that age. And what's interesting since is that the art world has opened up to thinking we need to be more inclusive. We actually do need to step up in terms of values. And of course, for us, like this was the foundation of what we were doing in the same way that we were also developing new sustainable materials. And that became, again, a concern of the sector many years later. So in the same way with the audiences and everything that we discussed today, I think we've been lucky that the timing was on our side. And with every company that is trying to change anything, timing is really key. So for us, timing did work out and did enable us to be here today.
Fantastic. And yeah, no, I haven't seen Lise for a while, but we used to invite her in when she was working for Feral Horses, which was this.
She's behind me as we speak.
There she is, yeah. I see. And I remember them being on. I think I'm right in saying that she was on the Alan Sugar Apprentice program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, she's a super smart brain, and I think that's the thing on my team is that generally I landed so lucky. Like everyone is beyond smart, and you know it's a joy every day. I mean, I get challenged every day. I think I have chosen both a relationship because my husband is also an entrepreneur, and both a team where every single day I'm being told off and I'm being challenged. But it seems that this is what clearly I like because I seem to choose it in every area of my life. But it is very much a team that constantly questions. You know, you can't just get by saying, I think X, it will be questioned. But it's enabled us to innovate and be here today.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could say a little bit more, Maureen, about a little bit, expand on what the mission of at the MT, presumably Marine Tanguy Art Agency, what a little bit more about its mission and maybe some current ongoing projects and where the future lies.
Yeah, its mission is to represent talents, but opening up the many revenue streams and opportunities that artists currently don't have access to. So traditionally, the core relationship with the arts was with the artworks. We believe that actually an artist can do much more than artworks. And we're seeing it today. They can do public art projects, digital projects, brand partnerships, creative collaboration, entertainment projects, you name it, you know, like they can generally influence society at large and drive it through their visual vision. And first, that was very much, how can we be the person that enable all those opportunities? And on the back of that, enable all those new audiences for the sector. What it also does is, as you know, it's a very unequal place to be an artist today. So it means that, like, if I think of one of my artists, Raven D. Clark, she's 27, she's behind 5 permanent sculptures in the States and Alabama that are readdressing how we treat slavery in art history. That's like a 2.2 million contract at 27 years old. This is game changing in regards to the female empowerment she will get and how she can reinvest into her artistic career. When you think that 97% of public art projects that you see on the street are done by men, that 3% is, and the fact that she's in that 3% is very meaningful. In terms of entertainment and partnership, we did the art, this kind of huge biodegradable frescoes for the documentary of David Attenborough with Apple TV last year, and that's a really good example. Or we also kicked off the World Cup in Qatar, again through sculptures and through video with another of our artists. So it's really opening up. I mean, again, that World Cup is 5 billion views, you know, it's opening up who gets to see art. And we talked about context before, but I'm a big believer in coming to different contexts with the artists. And however you're going to use those contexts, then I want you to be inspired artistically. And you know, obviously, that I have my book on this topic coming up literally early March. But my idea is that you live in a visual world and you get bombarded by imagery like hundreds of times every single day. And right now, it's mostly commercial imagery. There's very little time that you will have civic imagery, which will be around your role in society, or I don't know, mental health, or being inclusive, or artistic imagery. I want more artistic imagery because, of course, there's tons of studies that will show you that being constantly exposed to commercial imagery is making you feel really crap. We know the well-being nature of being exposed to the arts and how much it gives to us as human beings. Of course, we all do those jobs because we are a strong believer in that. So it's reshifting the position of the artist, not just in a tiny niche sector like the art world, right in the heart of society. And we do most of the public art that you will see on the streets of London, whether it's Crown Estate or Westminster or Camden, etc. Like, so it's very much on your way to work, when you look at your phone, on your collaborations. We want to be with you at all stages of your lives through the artists, and not just on a special occasion every few weeks, because we think that art being infused every single day is a much more inspiring life.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely fantastic mission, and I think all the listeners will identify with that as a. But as you say, it's a very you're unusual, you're entrepreneurial, you've disrupted in many ways. I think there are some other groups who are doing similar things. I even guessed on the podcast earlier, guests on the podcast like Claire Mander, who's working in a more niche. I think it's a very much a feminist project that she leads, but she
there's room for, so I think that's the good news, is the art world is 65 billion, but when you look at the cultural sector, it's 2.5 trillion, advertising sector 400 billion, video games will be the same, and then again the placemaking a similar amount. So there's so much room, and that's, I think, also what's positive at a time where the art world is actually going through a recession and is being hit financially, that there's a lot of new jobs to be creating. So it's not just going to be us. I mean, of course, we're ambitious, want to become a global company and want to lead that thinking, but there's a room for so many people to join that movement.
Is your kind of business model to try and pair up corporate sponsorship for a project with the artist, or to go to the government and ask for money?
And the answer is, would you both? Okay. I think, again, it's for us, we're in the business of telling stories with the art of the artist and comprehending when all values align and with whom. So we did a brilliant project in Paris with the Eiffel Tower on the Champ de Mars. It was like a biodegradable painting across the whole Champ de Mars. But here had the mayor of Paris, 30 companies, the Guardian Media Group, because the Guardian had just launched at the time in 2019 their sustainable wrap and was becoming a B Corp, and the Eiffel Tower. So again, I want everyone around the table. I feel art has the power to get everyone around the table. We've seen last year that it's so hard nowadays to get everyone around the table and to even get a single agreement across anything in life. So I feel art has that power to get different types of people and different types of bodies around the table. And that makes that conversation interesting, as much as people will be thinking very differently. It goes back to, on your first question, what was my favorite city? London is, because you can be constantly meeting people who are thinking differently to you. I think art is one of the last places where actually that space can exist. And that's why it's important to widen that space and really make sure everyone can come around that table to contribute to it.
Yeah, no, that all fits together really well. You I don't know whether you mind me asking you about you won the Forbes 30 under 30 in 2018. You were one of those people. So can you talk a little bit about, did you put in for that, or did they approach you?
So I definitely put in. I'm not going to disclose that they approached me, because I think in life you have to be aware that a lot.
Actually, I think that they don't. I think that you do put in for it anyway, don't you?
You have to put yourself forward, but I think it's also good to hear for people that they have to put themselves forward, that they should just not wait. It was a magical moment, because disrupting the art world is difficult, as we all know, and sometimes there are attacks, sometimes there are challenges, sometimes there are people who don't wish you the very best as the answer. And therefore receiving Forbes 30 or 30 was like a tap on the back to say, you're on track to doing something that actually matters. Or at least, whether it's about the Forbes or whether it's about me during that period, Forbes felt like a tap in the back. It felt like, keep going, you're onto something. And it was a nice tap in the back. I'm actually this year the judge for that category, Europe, Culture and Art. So it's really nice to be back in for loop. My boyfriend at the time, we were in New York because we had just finished a project in New York, and because of my name, because of the T, I was right at the end. He didn't want to tell me that the list had just been released, And he went very silent in a different corner of the room and swiped endlessly. And obviously, as you swipe, there's less and less chances that you actually could be on it. I think it was actually more stress for me than I was for myself. I think I didn't think I could have it. I think Will really wanted me to have it. And so I just remember it as a really fun moment also for my relationship of how much Will felt I deserved it and was happy that I got it, and how sweet he had shielded me from telling me the list was released until he could see my name on it.
That's a lovely story. Well, actually, another of the podcast guests who's actually an alumna of mine, Elsa Atkinson, she's now based in New York. She's an artist, but she won that award for designing these sustainable bags to carry your artwork home in. It's called Spongy Bags. Rather strange title, but
I think it's incredible what she's doing.
Yeah.
But I feel it's something, because I'm fresh of having written that book and I'm fresh of having written the acknowledgements. There was a study by the Harvard Review that said that actually when it comes to the press, female leaders rarely get smart as an adjective. They try very hard, they work very hard, they have loads of enthusiasm and energy, and then the guys get genius and smart and all of this, right? And of course it's shifting, and I think actually it is an exciting time to see that shift happening. But Forbes was that. Forbes for me was like saying, you know, the way you see the world has, you know, is valid somehow for some people. And, you know, and because again, as a woman, you rarely hear it. It was nice to hear it. It was nice to hear that actually maybe there's value in what we're building. So it helped my confidence, I think, and it was more of a personal story with it because my confidence was boosted in thinking I could do it. But I think it could have been done through something else. But I think for me that was the Forbes.
That's great. And I think the main reason that I invited you now as a guest, Maureen, was that you're about to have a book, your first book published, and it's, if I'm right, it's titled Visual Detox. It's going to be published by Penguin in early March. Maybe we could start by saying, where did you get the idea for that?
I think it's actually, so I grew up in a place, again, we mentioned Neil Duray, where there's not a single artwork. It's a very visually beautiful place. And when I was little, and I'm sure we can all relate to that, if I felt sad or unhappy, I will go and sit by the sea and just let the wave quite literally absorbs you emotionally, and you will feel better. Like it was one of those like really silly things, but it was very effective. And I had loads of tricks like this that were visual tricks that just made me cope and made me mental health wise be able to navigate the life I kind of I was in. So that was my first experience to it. I think you are discouraged a lot on thinking that visuals is decorative, it's a bit fluffy, it's a bit superficial. So I kind of parked it, entered the art world still through this relationship of visuals. But again, and that's why we disrupted it, my relationship with it was slightly different. It wasn't just because I wanted to, you know, a social status or a very luxury lifestyle. I actually generally felt I needed those visuals, the stories of the artists, this involvement in the visual world. It was a much more essential and necessary relationship with it than what the market was telling me I should have as a relationship, and hence the company we built. So I think it kept going in my brain, that essential relationship with visuals and the happiness it gave me, the approach to life it gave me, had been something that now on a day-to-day basis as a business was inspiring others and was enabling others to kind of connect with visuals better. Also, it's really interesting, but 65% of us are visual learners. We're not verbal learners. We connect with visuals better. They get to our brain much faster than words. And yet there's very little visual education at school. We don't really talk about it, but we're shaped by it. If you see 3 times an advert, you're very likely to buy that product or act on that insecurity or act on that behavior. So it clearly is something that, like a fish in the water, you're kind of not realizing that water is here, but you actually swim in it every single day. Until it became so obvious that I kept being told something has to be written about visual thinking, visual critical thinking in the visual world we live in. Again, that goes back to insecurities, but I just thought, I'm my own author. Can I actually publish a book and write something that is of that standard that I would want the idea to be carried in? So before I approach publishing houses, I wrote the book because I was so scared that I was not capable of doing it. Yes, normally you should never do that.
Yeah,
well, actually,
yeah, no,
because it's also a waste of time, because then your editor is going to destroy it and totally change every part of it. But I think deep down, I was like, am I capable to write something of that lens, of that caliber? And then I got really into the neuroscience of it, like how visual shapes you, they shape your brain, the role of the artist could play in that visual world, the many changes we need to make at the society, and how visuals could very much enable those, the rise of AI, and how visual critical thinking is actually going to be key in understanding that misinformation. My brain got really excited. I read the book, as you can see, the excitement rose. I was like, I found it so interesting. This is all the reasons I'm in. And I wrote it. Penguin was my first choice. I think there's a thing in me where I was like, I didn't think I could get my first choice, but it was totally my first choice. I could not believe it that they believed in it.
So it was literally the first publisher you approached, and they took it.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is a ridiculous story, but I must say also I'm represented by Curtis Brown, which enabled that process. So this is not me knocking on the door of my own. Is I have a publishing agent, Gordon Wise, will enable me to do this. So because otherwise it will look like a completely random story, which it isn't. But the truth is that it was my first choice. My Aunt Tatapu, my editor, was a total dream come true, because she's an incredibly smart woman, one of the first Black editor at the Penguin Group, wanting to completely reshape how we approached essentials topics like the visual world, like visual thinking. And also they are able to make topics like this mainstream. And again, back to our conversation about the sector, I want the importance and the role of the arts to be mainstream. I don't want it to be niche. And I think a publisher like this is able to make it mainstream. It was incredibly challenging to do as a process. We spoke about it earlier, but I was giving birth as all the comments were coming in from my editors, and as the company was scaling. And yeah, life was very full on as I did this, but I'm incredibly proud. I think it's always funny, because I think it's happened to many authors. Would you have an idea for a second book now? Because when you go so deep in, then you start getting really interested, and then you now have other ideas. So I'm doing a TED, not a TEDx, a TED in March on visual prejudices, which has basically been one of the topics that emerged from writing this book, that actually there was a second book that would be really interesting to write. So it's clearly an endless quest, an endless intellectual quest, but it's very much our values as a business. And I'm excited for people to feel I can connect with the visual language, I can discuss things visually, I can engage in this world, I can participate in it. Because so far you are made to feel that this is a language imposed on you, and you can only be passive, but you can't really participate in it. So I hope it enables people to feel they can participate in it.
That's brilliant. I mean, one of the things I find myself often saying to my students is, if I'm taking them around a gallery, I will often say, look, go around and look on your own for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll go through. And if there's anything that's caught any of your eyes, we'll return to it and you can talk about it. And I noticed that people, and this is observational of people in general, and I'm sure that you've researched this, or at least thought about it in your book. We can come to that. People, how long do people spend looking at a painting in a gallery? Typically, our culture is about ticking off and taking selfies in front of. So one of the things I say to them is, do any of you listen to like classical music? And one of them said, I said, who do you like? Vivaldi, Mozart. I said, well, how long is a Mozart symphony approximately? They say, well, 35 minutes. And I said, well, shouldn't you be looking at this painting for 35 minutes? The artist has put as much time, very often they've put as much time into creating that work and thinking about it as, say, a classical composer has into a time-based form of artistic experience. And I practice what I preach. I will go back to an exhibition if I can, and then just pick out 2 or 3 works and spend a lot of time with them. And there's this kind of, I often talk about an empty space between oneself and the and the work of art, which becomes a conversation with the artists. And I quite often say to my students, who are often prejudiced about a certain kind of art, if it's actually even more important if you go to like a new contemporary art show and it's difficult, to stand there and think, what is this artist hasn't made this for no reason. They have made this to communicate with me. So just think about what they're trying to actually say to you. Almost imagine yourself in conversation with them. So I just wondered to what extent those ideas of looking at art come into your book, because you kindly sent me a proof. Thank you very much. But I've only just started reading. It's fascinating.
I was not. I think what you discuss is visual literacy. Now, we are taught to read at school and learn to read at school. And I think assuming that you could just get things is not possible, especially because it lies on so many layers of privileges. If I think of my kids, like they would have been exposed to so much art that, of course, they're going to feel more comfortable. I had that conversation recently with one of my investors who said, why do people struggle to put themselves in uncomfortable places? Because that's obviously where a lot of the growth will happen. But I said, you're confident, you're from the top universities in France, like you just have so many layers that made you feel, I can put myself in an uncomfortable situation, which then makes you okay to being comfortable because you've got this net and this confidence and everything that we know. So literacy is the same. And maybe you remember, or at least I remember, especially learning English as I had just arrived in the country, reading the first 2 pages of the FT and wanting to cry and not understanding a single word of it. Like it just was so like overwhelming that I just did not understand what I was reading. And I feel that this is the same with the artistic language, the visual language. We can't just assume that this can be understood. And also, especially when we know that traditionally, this is an education that was really given to your upper middle class and your upper class. That there's a whole history in this country specifically, that the history of taste, the history of the arts, even the Grand Tour was dedicated to a type of people. So if we know this historically, then we know that most people were not exposed to it. And we're also specifically made to feel that this was not for them. So I feel that the way I look at it is, rather than just assuming that they could get it, I would encourage a visual literacy through, for instance, when I tried with my first is 4 years old, so I did a very low-end visual critical thinking course in his school for like a day. But even like how the composition of the picture is structured, how this is affected how you feel, where do your eyes wander, where does the scale affect? So you look at the same image in different scale, like how does this affect the messaging of the image that you get? There are ways in which to teach this, in the same way that there are ways to teach you how to read. So I feel just coming back to basics and making people feel, let's just understand the many triggers this wax and those visuals can transcend. And then I can't wait for them to put themselves in uncomfortable places, because I agree, the beauty of the sector is that you should specifically look for art that you don't like, or at least makes you feel deeply uncomfortable, because usually the answers lie right in why you're feeling uncomfortable. So it's, but I feel you need a first step, and that first step is making people feel that this is their language. It's not something that is taught to them. It's not something that they should just know and say really intellectual things straight away, but actually it's a language that they can speak, and they are a very easy way to decode it before they step up to think, actually, I love it and I can't wait to dive in.
Yeah, one of the essays I encourage my students to read is Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction, which is all about what you were saying about social privilege and cultural capital that some people are born with. And I totally agree with you, and it worries me that we keep hearing about art history only now being taught in privileged schools. I think there's a kind of inverse gender problem there, because like my son went to an all-boys school and it had a sister school next door, and he was quite interested he was potentially interested in doing an art history A-level, and they didn't deliver it at the boys' school, and they did at the girls' school, but they wouldn't let them come in and sit in on, and that's why I think it's a good, obviously on many ways, this is a really good thing, but like 90% of my students have always been women. And people say that's a bit strange, as you've got the word business that we associate as a more masculine word. in the
and
title.
especially because it's not represented in the power scheme after this of the sector. But I think it comes down, I think we have a perception issue as a sector, and I hope the coming years we will organize ourselves to shift that perception. The first perception issue is to think that this is only for a certain group of people. The second, I agree that it's just decorative and fluffy, which lands on the girls, you know, like, because obviously anything innovative, deep and smart has to land on the boys. But it's that thing of, how do we shift that perception? How do we show? One thing I was doing with investors and VCs at the start of the company, I was taking through the National Gallery and showing them how innovation was fueled through the works, meaning when the industries were creating new pigments, Turner was using it. When the discovery of the optics was happening, Turner was using it in his paintings. Like, it's the same across every single century. And art has always been part of innovation, has always was driving society forward and was driving all this conversation. So that's what I mean, it's a perception issue. Is we think of innovation, and right now we think of AI and tech and science. We don't think of the arts first and foremost. And so we need, as a sector, to go back onto what are the current daily priorities that everyone discusses in those topics. How do we embrace those? How do we push them forward and innovate in them, both in terms of technically innovation, but also conceptual innovation? Because throughout history, as you know, we were very much side by side with all the other sectors that we're innovating. It was never in silo. But I think that perception has shifted over the past 50 years. And I think you see it with our current government, where, you know, the focus is on tech, on science, on business. But what's actually, and I was so happy that McKinsey supported that report back in December. But ironically, our sector is number 2 in the UK in terms of generating, you know, added revenue, and it's just as big as the food and beverage sector, and doing as well as the hospitality sector, and it's a very strong sector for the UK. So it's really learning, how do we promote this? How do we inform people of this? That it's not just us fluffy people on the corner, but actually not only this is something that benefits people, not just on the economical side, on a well-being level, but on the second part, it's actually a really exciting sector. Like, as an investor, this, and what you said with our company, we're a fast-growing company. My investors have made money from us. Like, this is an exciting sector to be part of. It's not just something that you do because, you know, there's nothing else left, and it's really nice and decorative. So that's what I mean by the perception issue, and I hope it changes through that, through new models, through new spokespeople and artists. That really shows that this is more than just that side note.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking that, you know, there's so many models in the history of art that we study. You know, classical Athens is a good example of a, you know, so if I'm teaching classical art to my students, ancient classical art and Greek art, I make a big point out of the fact that, like, when they're looking at a vase painting, or a wine pot, if you like, it's private art. It was made for an elite. We know it was made and used for an elite of aristocrats. So we have to bear in mind that mindset when we look at that kind of art. And yet Athens was filled with, you know, so important to them, the public art, albeit as propaganda, if you like, of Athenian Empire, but also of democracy and so on. So, you know, and you read so much in ancient art history about art being for the people. So Pliny, who is our main source for Greek art, he certainly takes a position whereby, you know, when the Romans come along, we ourselves have made art private. We've put it in our houses, and it's no longer for the public. He makes a big critique of that. And then, of course, we get the Republic of Florence, where, you know, Michelangelo's David was originally actually in a public space, and now it's in a museum. I often say to my students, I don't like museums. You know, the National Gallery you were talking about, I don't like the fact that there are these religious altarpieces that were originally in their proper context in a church, where people wouldn't just sit there for 30 minutes and look at them. They'd actually engage with them spiritually. You know, in a certain kind of candlelight, if you like. It was a very different experience. So art history, of course, doesn't really look at that so much as the work itself on the gallery wall and how to formally analyze it.
I think that's really interesting, how we want certain walls to signify value of this artifact, but actually that the context itself could be just as valuable. I mean, that is spot on, probably a next podcast for you, a really difficult conversation on where do your artworks belong and where should they be? That is not me that's going to do this one, but I think it's a really interesting conversation. I feel clearly I value context and I value everyday context. And I will probably lean on the fact that therefore it's the relationship with the context and the audience that also matters, is that constant conversation with people that matters. It's definitely different to the way we've been taught art. But I think, again, there's a place for everyone, and there's a place for every discourse. We said about being uncomfortable and being in rooms where people don't agree. But I think the place of the context is definitely what I think is the most interesting conversation right now, because obviously, if you think of the British Museum or the places, like, context is being challenged. And I think the study of context and visual context is really interesting. Probably another book, but not today on that podcast.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and this is a this is a conversation that we're having all the time now, you know, where I teach, because obviously education is expected to lead on these issues. Unfortunately, it very often just reacts to it. And I think the art world, unfortunately, isn't proactive very often in these kind of, you know, it takes something like the Floyd killing to wake people up, and it's really sad that it takes things like that for that to happen. But it sounds to me, Maureen, as though you're trying to get people to think ahead. You know, we shouldn't need these things to happen before we actually you know, we're human beings, we're Homo sapiens. You know, we should be thinking ahead of the game and leading. The art world has always led discussions and debates in these social issues.
And I definitely don't want any guilt on anyone listening. Like, we are conditioned a lot of the time, and that's a lot of the book. Like, we are conditioned to think a certain way. Like, it takes time to literally think against yourself. That's one of my favorite sentences. There's a book in France on how to think against yourself. But I think, I guess, my book is to help you to visually think against the visuals you see every day. But that takes time to think against yourself, because there's so much conditioning at stake. And of course, it's uncomfortable, and we all want to be liked, and we all want to be appreciated. And it's, I would definitely not have any form of guilt. We've all been there trying to please and endorse something that actually many years back we felt I should have said something very different. Like I mentioned, I think critical thinking takes time. Visual critical thinking is what we're trying to introduce and takes time. So there's no guilt to have. It's a very natural human feeling.
Yeah, and I think I assume, but maybe wrongly, that your book is going to say something about the healing power of art in a world filled with commercial images.
Yeah, well, I think it's, I mean, the thing is, we know all of this. All the academics have already published endless studies saying that the arts contributes to us. But the problem is we've parked it, and we are very little exposed to it on a day-to-day basis. You know, I've already probably consumed 300 images that told me to be sexy. At no point did these images told me anything else this morning. So it's really changing and shifting. What do we first want to see as we wake up in the morning? And what do we want our streets and our cities to say? Like, do we want to be in that place with just commercial imagery, or do we want more civic spaces where those conversations exist and they are guided by artists? Like, I think that's really the key conversations to be having now.
Yeah, and I guess the Fourth Plinth was an example now some time ago of a really, really good positive response, you know, making the public look at a work of art in a certain imperialist colonial context, that with the National Gallery behind it as well. You know, I think the Fourth Plinth was a wonderful idea, and I guess that your book but also your work is engaging with that kind of art world, rather than, if you like, the art that goes into private collections and private houses.
I mean, we do this too because I think actually who is collecting and the diversity of collectors, as we know, is changing, and a lot of collectors want to support new ways of thinking. So ironically, a lot of the artists that we've supported have done incredibly well, from exhibiting at Gagosian up to having recorded auctions. So it's ironic that I think it's benefited the art collecting and the investment side, because I think people see that change is much needed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I get that entirely. And actually, you know, some of the most interesting minds that I engage with are actually private collectors, you know, and there's a kind of myth maybe that these people are just, you know, buying art to signify their wealth and cultural standing and so on. But there are some like that, obviously, but an awful lot of people are actually much more engaged in that, much more philanthropic in their, potentially philanthropic in their outlook, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed. Agreed. So nice to
Anyway,
speak.
Maureen, we very much look forward to the publication of your book. And I mean, certainly from the pages I've already read, it's very unpretentious and filled with useful facts. And you've got an amazing memory for statistics, because I've heard you've been quoting, you know,
it's a visual.
absolutely.
If you
Yeah.
give us stats, like you see the scale of the problem, it's much easier to remember it.
Yeah, you visualize the $65 billion as opposed to sort of see the word. I think that's very important, because you know, you need to visualize how much money that actually is, on how little it is compared to a day on the stock exchange, you know, which is another interesting thing about the value of art, the financial value of art compared to the cultural value. Anyway, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the listeners, and I will give details about your forthcoming book in the literature that goes with that accompanies the podcast. So thank you very much, Marie, for giving up your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.